Good evening. Welcome to the work session of the Buena Vista Board of Trustees. This work session has to do with the Carbonate Street Development Phase 1 deed restrictions. Today is February 28th, 2023. And Joseph is going to be leading this meeting for the most part. And then we have representatives from Fading West. So Joseph, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor, trustees, staff. Yes, thank you for all for being here. While I just get set up, maybe we can do a quick round of introductions from the Fading West team, and then we can jump in.
So I'm Blair Seaman, Chief of Development for Fading West.
I'm Jack Jones. I'm Director of Strategic Finance for Fading West.
I'm Scott Simmons, Director of Development for Fading West.
Wonderful. So thank you all for being here and especially for scheduling this time. I know this has been a project that's been on everyone's radar for a while, and yet this is another hour and a half out of your day. So thank you very much. As I try to figure out how to move this bar down. Stop that share real quick. Sorry about that. And navigate to the, oh, there we go. Okay. So the hope for tonight is to begin with just a few minutes of level setting and a recap. Most of you have been very involved in various affordable housing conversations over the past few years. But I did feel like it was relevant to the discussion tonight to make sure that some of that information was fresh in our minds. And so I'll be giving just a very quick recap of a presentation that Becky Gray put together and gave to this board in February of last year on affordable housing. We'll talk briefly about phase 1 itself, the overall timeline that we're looking at, a couple of potential upcoming amendments that we might ask for on the property conveyance agreement related to the timeline. And then we'll be diving into and hopefully spending most of the time on really the factors of the development that are influencing its affordability. Yes, those will end up being captured in the document of the deed restrictions, but as you saw from the watermarks on the deed restriction of the development agreement, those are provided as illustrative documents. They're not agreed upon yet, they're not finalized, and so we're hoping to keep the conversation less so on the detailed clauses of those agreements. Obviously, if you have questions, Jeff is here and can explain, but more so on understanding the underlying factors of the development itself and how those affect its affordability. So with that, a very brief overview of the updated site plan, or sketch plan, I should say. The last time you all saw this represented graphically was in June of last year, and you probably recall that it was 2 buildings total. The first floor of which of one of the buildings was the childcare space. I mentioned, I think it was in one of the January meetings in my staff report, that we were looking at needing to pull the childcare building or space out and separate that. There are a number of benefits to that, to the project, but in which we can go into later if you have questions. But this site sketch does represent that concept where there's 2 apartment buildings, totaling 60 apartment units, 30 of which, so half of which are studio apartments, 24 of which are 1 bedrooms, and 6 of which are 2 bedrooms. And then this also represents that childcare concept being on Carbonate Street. And we've also gotten some updated guidance recently from state licensing authorities that their rules around playgrounds for childcare centers have shifted and actually opened up a little bit to where they actually say you don't have to build dedicated play space for childcare if there's a park within walking distance. And that actually benefits not only the cost of building childcare space, as you can imagine, but also in this specific context, it allows that play area that had been assumed to needing to be fenced in and sort of closed off to actually be open and to be more of a pocket park as an amenity to this development and to the surrounding buildings and community than it is solely a childcare playground. I think that's a huge benefit to this updated sketch plan. So I won't spend too much time on this. If you have specific questions about this, we're happy to dive into them, but we did want to spend most of the time on the affordability components. So this is this and the next 3 slides are from that presentation that Becky Gray put together and gave to this board in February of last year. And it was really designed to try to walk through from a high level, how does affordable housing get built in the first place and why is it so difficult? And so this slide really starts to walk us through conceptually the idea that the cost to build, let's say 50 apartment units that are market rate is largely the same as the cost to build 50 units that are quote unquote affordable. The cost of the construction isn't demonstrably different necessarily. And so typically when developers come to projects, whether they're market rate or affordable, they bring a bit of cash to the table, right? That's usually their equity. Maybe they already own the property or they're purchasing it. They bring that to the table. Everything else from the developer's perspective, they need to fill somehow, right? They have cash. It's usually a small percentage of the capital stack. They need to fill that. Generally it's with debt, but that debt needs to be paid back, right? And those debt payments are paid back from either rent proceeds or sale proceeds if it's a for sale project. So the only way that we can hope to lower the rents below what would normally be required to pay back the debt associated with a market rate project is by introducing subsidies of some sort, right? And the most go-to subsidy that we all think about is tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, right? And so that's how Collegiate Commons was built. Low-income housing tax credits were brought that made up the majority of the funding needed to build that project. And then they were able to charge less for rent moving forward because they had carried less debt to build it. So the basic idea behind almost all affordable housing is that there's some level of subsidy involved to allow those rents to be lowered. And so those are, you see some other examples up there about subsidies, and we'll talk more about that. So the very top of the screen is cut off a little bit behind the Zoom piece, but this slide is showing AMI levels of between 60 and 80% for Chaffee County. And so the next sort of row underneath that, which again, this is sort of small, so my apologies, is looking at how much on an annual basis a single person household in that AMI range makes, translated into hourly wages here. This is a number, 16.9% is how much of the Chaffee County workforce actually earns that amount of money, according to 2021 data. And then subsequently putting all these inputs in, using the idea that housing should not be more than 30% of your household budget. This is how much rent should be or housing costs should be for this AMI range, anywhere from 60% down in the 800s up to around 1,150 for 80%. Keep in mind, this is for a single person household, right? We have more people in the household, those numbers would go up. And then as we look over on this graphic, and Becky did a great job of walking us through this last February, you'll recall that the graphic is meant to represent the dark blue is sort of conventional funding that anyone might be able to bring to any housing project. And the upper part in that black bracket, in this case about 40 or 50%, is the level of subsidy needed to lower the rents down to that 60 to 80% AMI range. So in this very basic visual, we understand that you cannot expect or ask for those rents if we do not have almost, and in some cases, half of the money up front in subsidy to build those units in the first place.
So real quickly, just to clarify, 16.9% of Chaffee County workforce make that or above?
No, make this range.
Just that range?
Just that range.
Okay.
Yep. And so as we go through this, we're looking at 60 to 120% or so. That's about 45% of Chaffee County workforce when we combine all those ranges together. So the next slide represents the 80 to 100% range. You'll see the annual salaries move up in that range. So this at the top end This is 2022 baseline data for 100% AMI. So the average median income of someone, single person household living in Chaffey County is $57,000 in 2022. Jaffa updates these numbers usually every springtime, sometime in April. So we do expect updates here in the next few months. This hourly range, in this range, it's about 16% of our workforce and associated rents. And then we see in this scenario, because the rents can be higher, they can pay back larger amounts of conventional financing or debt. And so subsidy only really needs to make up between 20 and 30% of a capital stack to achieve these kind of rents. The final graphic continues this line of thinking into the 100 to 120% AMI range. So these are folks earning at or just above the area median income for Chaffey County. And in these projects, we're still, picture someone earning that 57,000 or 60,000 as a single household. They still can't afford rent in Chaffey County without subsidy, or we can't expect to provide housing for them at levels that they can sustain without subsidy, 10 to 15% of the capital stack. So I share all these again in that mentality of making sure that this information is fresh in our minds, because these levers that we're going to talk about, these variables, all relate back to the capital stack and how we can achieve the best affordability for the capital stack that we're pursuing, or that this project has. And I should note real quick, I'm the one going through this presentation from staff side, but I anticipate most of the discussion will end up being with you all in Fading West. I'm happy to answer questions from staff. But we did kind of co-create this together. So a brief moment on project timeline. So you all may recall, we are under contract at the moment. We have executed that property conveyance agreement. It's set to close 30 days after the entitlement due diligence deadline or period ends. That period is supposed to end right now at the end of March. And we do anticipate asking or bringing forward an amendment to that property conveyance agreement sometime in March to you all to extend that deadline by 90 days. And really that's driven by some of these changes that we've seen in the site plan, right? Separating the buildings allows for the town to actually end up owning the childcare property itself. That's pushed the subdivision back a little bit. It's also tweaked a few assumptions in our site planning process. So some of these entitlement pieces are being pushed back, but it's also related to, on the right side of the slide, you see some of the notifications we're expecting from grants. We hope to hear on the incentives grant application we submitted as soon as mid-March. If we are awarded something, we might have a contract in place as soon as April for that grant program. We hope to hear on the transformational housing grant program in May. That contract would be a slower process and wouldn't come in until August. So those are the two kind of subsidy pieces that we really want to have a solid understanding of before we move to close on the property. That's the primary reason why we're going to be asking to push that entitlement period back by 90 days. The overall project schedule is still in line with what we've been talking about for the past basically year. We're really hoping and shooting for that tenant move in July of 2024. That remains unchanged. So let's dive in to the actual affordability of Carbonate Street Phase 1. And I wanted to outline the 5 variables that the team, and when I say the team, it's really these gentlemen and myself that have really been thinking about all these variables that go into making a project happen. There's hundreds, right? So we had to figure out how to narrow that down to a small set of variables that we can change and have everything else remain constant in order to see what those levers do and what those variables do to the affordability. So those 5 variables are the amount of subsidy. We requested $3 million in grant program or grant support. Obviously, we've all discussed that the town does have ARPA funding that you may or may not choose to bring to this project. Land value is being contributed, and yet child care center is being requested. And so largely that's a sort of a net zero effect. Deed restrictions, we've talked about this a little bit, but the length of time those deed restrictions are effective for is a variable that was worth pulling out and treating as a variable, right? Whether they're in perpetuity, maybe they're 30 years, maybe they're 15 years. All that has effect on the affordability. The childcare core and shell costs. You all have seen the data from our community engagement. You all know the need of childcare in our community, and you all have said we want to see childcare in this project. And right now, that model, the childcare cost, that core and shell, is being paid for out of the general project costs. And therefore, the debt and the financing associated with building that needs to be paid back through the rents. So that childcare cost directly impacts affordability. And so if that cost goes up, it affects affordability. If we take that cost way down or eliminate it, it affects affordability. General construction costs are another variable. Obviously, with Fading West model of modular construction, there's a lot less uncertainty that goes into construction costs, given the way that they're able to dial in their model, but there's still unknowns. And then there's infrastructure costs, or really the public improvements associated with this project. There's kind of an outweighed amount of public improvements where we might compare this to a normal sort of development of its size. Carbonate Street itself is not paved at all right now, right? It's not improved. We're looking at adding substantial amounts of parking. We're looking at adding a pocket park. All these things are public improvements that would maybe not necessarily be associated with normal development. So again, these are the 5 variables that in your packets, you all had scenarios that we'll walk through in a moment. Those are the scenarios that were changed, or these are the variables that were changed in each of those scenarios to produce the different AMI levels. So I've basically just reformatted the same scenarios that were in your packet for the screen. So this is the scenario that was called the base case. And I sort of flip-flop the numbers a little bit in the sense that those 5 variables we just discussed are on the top as inputs. Those are the things that in these scenarios are changing and that can change the most. And those all create different outputs or different levels of affordability. So this is base case, and obviously we can go back and forth between these as discussion continues. Best case assumes, hey, we get almost all the grants we asked for. Permanent deed restrictions, childcare costs are at the low end of what we expect them to be. Construction costs are at the low end of what we expect them to be. Infrastructure costs at the low end. That's the best case scenario, right? Leads to the best weighted average AMI of 95% for the whole project. And then worst case, kind of taking that pendulum and swinging to the other end. What happens if we don't get any grants? Perhaps the town chooses to pitch in with ARPA funding, but in exchange, the childcare space has to be cut, right, in this scenario. Construction costs are elevated, infrastructure costs are elevated, and you all see what that does to the affordability. The weighted average actually hasn't moved that much, right? It's up to 105%, but deed restrictions are at 15 years in this scenario, which allows for those AMIs to be lower during that period, but creates uncertainty about the affordability after that time period. So I know I'm kind of zooming through this, but I did want to leave most of our time for discussion. So I'll just kind of end there that really this time, I really hope that you all each get to dive into this data, these scenarios, ask all your questions of Fading West that you'd like, and we'll see where the topic goes. We do have a couple of other pieces of information we can pull up if they're helpful to the conversation as we go. We will be listening for your cues and direction that you might convey around things like affordability targets, especially what's more important to you, affordability of studios or of 2 bedrooms, or the weighted average is what's most important, but that overall range is less important. Or how important is that childcare space as we start to see how it affects affordability, right? Those are things that we're just going to be listening for. We're not asking for any decisions or hard and fast decisions tonight. So yeah, I will end there. Turn it back over.
Peter?
Yeah, I just want to clarify on earlier in the presentation when you were showing when I was asking about 16%, is that above or is that you're, if I'm not mistaken, the range you were showing was 60 to 80% there, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, but then even in the best case scenario, we're looking at 80% AMI. that correct for the studios?
Yeah. and
So
I'll-
that
I'll let-
16 is probably more like the 5% bracket.
And I don't have that data on how much of our workforce earns at 80%.
Yeah, I'm just to make sure that like mine's in the same number, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
And all these scenarios are one-person household scenarios too.
Yeah,
Which is important to remember.
the only exception to that is that, as you saw in our deed restriction document, we do set definitions so that we're all looking at the same data, right? So studio apartments are equated to one-person households. One bedrooms are equated to 1.5 person households. And then two bedrooms are equated to 3-person households. And those are what affects the numbers of rents being charged, right? So a 2-bedroom is assuming a 3-person household when it's looking at what's affordable rent. And all that data is directly from CHAFA. So yeah, on these slides here.
So is one of the possibilities here that we add money, in addition to the land that we've donated? You know, if we can't get grants, if we can't get sufficient grants to hit the best case scenario, do we end up putting money in? And if we do have to put money in, do we ever get it back? Like, you know, at the end of the deed restrictions, my assumption is that that means that the property gets sold and the rents go up. At that point, though, do we get any of the money back? If we had to put extra cash in, do we ever get that back?
Yeah, so the way it's envisioned right now is the town would own the childcare space outright. So once the apartments and childcare space were built, that property would be separately platted and the town would own that going forward. If you're talking about just putting in cash to the capital stack up front to, you know, help affordability targets, that money would not come back to the town later. Like, you can think of that as basically, you know, contributing as subsidy toward the affordability for whatever the duration of that deed restriction timeline is.
That's the way the model has been run, assuming there isn't a repayment.
So we don't become just like another equity investor.
No, it would be a grant. So it would be treated as a grant, or I'll say the model, the way we've run it, treats it as a grant.
Right, okay.
How many years does Fading West plan to, because I think that was in there, at some point it would turn over back to the town, or the town would buy whatever, but what was the time frame on that?
So what's been envisioned thus far has been at least 10 years, just because, one, this location is in a qualified opportunity zone. So as we're fundraising for an equity investment, that's a pretty attractive thing to be able to offer. I think that's likely the number we're gonna assume for purposes of planning for this, in terms of how long Fading West actually owns it, or how long the project entity that Fading West raises actually owns it. Not 100% sure, but we would likely be committing to at least 10 years, depending on the equity we raise, just because that opportunity zone tax benefits would be really helpful.
Do you know what would be the max amount of time?
It really would be dependent upon sort of investor, the investors who own the property, what their, how their situation changes or their view on the investment. So it's hard to say. I mean, I think, again, it could be longer, it certainly could be longer than the 10 years, but it would really come down to their hold period, desires, and how they want to look, you know, get their money back effectively.
Sure. I only ask because let's say we're in a scenario where deed restrictions run out 15 years and you're there for 20. What happens then? Because you sell them all at market, right? Like, right? And so to me, that's a little bit of a concern. I'm like, what's the timeline and where those deed restrictions fall in place in terms of, you know?
So the model we ran, or the scenarios we ran, the reason we reduced to 15 years in the worst case was that provides the ability, at least during the 15-year period, to lower the AMIs. Joseph pointed out the average AMI only changed 5% from 100 in the base case to 105 in the worst case. And a key contributor of that is shortening the duration of the AMI restrictions, because you're right, it does imply that after the 15 years, those move to market.
Right.
And so that would be more attractive to somebody who would buy it in that 10 to 15 year period.
Right.
Yeah, and so.
And I think we should add that like the 15-year scenario, Joseph, I think intentionally showed that only showed 400,000 of subsidy, because frankly, the subsidies and grants we're pursuing at this point, we would almost certainly not get with 15-year deed restrictions. Like if we're getting any sort of subsidy from the state, the deed restriction timeline is likely going to have to be longer than 15 years.
Gotcha. Okay, well, that's good.
The 30 year is sort of the baseline for one of the grants.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. Thank
You
you.
look deep in thought, Mark.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question for Joseph or Fading West, but as far as the subsidies, are you guys totally pursuing those, or is town doing part of that?
It's been collaborative thus far.
Okay, is there, it's maybe a timeline question. When do we really have to make some hard decisions? Is there a point where, okay, we're not getting subsidies, or we are? Is there going to be a point where to move the project forward? Is there a timeline on that when we really have to make those hard decisions? And after that decision, are we still going to be pursuing subsidies and grants to support this project?
Yeah, they're great question. I'll let Fading West team.
There's definitely a
timeline.
Yeah, there's definitely a timeline. I mean, I think the slide that talked about when we find out about if we're gonna actually get subsidies and what those contract amounts will be.
Mhm.
I think those are milestones in which we need to start making some hard decisions.
Right.
Hopefully not. I mean, hopefully we get the subsidies as they come in. But I think it's like what, the end of April, end of March, around April, that will be the first milestone. And then May will be the second milestone. And depending on those outcomes, we'll need to figure out how to structure the project.
And the final, when we end our diligence and then agree ultimately to the property conveyance, we will have in place when we complete that process, the deed restriction document and the documents that Joseph provided to you in representative form. So you all will have obviously input on that. We'll be negotiating that with you all. And so that's the real final milestone, because that will document the deed restrictions that'll be attached to the property conveyance.
Okay.
So that's certainly a date where you'll have, I'll say, final sign.
Get some real answers.
Yeah.
Something
Yeah.
that we really get our teeth into.
And just to touch on kind of the last part of your question, I think if we hear back, say, on both those grant application dates, and it doesn't turn out well, we don't get the grant funding we're applying for, I wouldn't say it totally removes the possibility that there is still some potential grant funding we could bring into this project, but these are two pretty unique grant programs in that they're available for essentially workforce housing. Most, I mean, as Joseph kind of touched on initially here, a lot of that money is kind of earmarked for stuff that's 60% AMI and below. So we're in a pretty, I think, unique and lucky opportunity here that we are able to pursue grant funding for stuff that's in that middle income range. And that's likely not a pot of money that's going to be around indefinitely. We expect those grants to get doled out pretty quickly.
And I'll just add a couple of notes there. I think that's part of why we want to amend the property conveyance agreement, so that we're not asking you all for a decision that has big contingencies within it. Right? We want you all to have the data, the information, the certainties that you need to be able to fully execute encumbrances on the property, conveying that property to Fading West and moving forward with the development. And we don't anticipate having those certainties, especially because so much of the rest of the project is dependent on these two grant applications until the June 30th, or hopefully sooner than that timeline. And on the flip side, should we hear that we don't get we'll learn if we don't get them on those timelines too, and we'll be back right in front of you the next day, right, asking how do we proceed as a community, because this is an important project, right? Right now we're hinging our hopes on two grants. If those don't come through, we will be back at the table looking at what does that mean for the project. And the last thing I'll say, kind of to Jack's point, The transformational, so the incentives grant was, we were in the last round of that program. That program will no longer be a program. The transformational housing grant, they were intending it to last for 3 to 4 years. Well, after 3 rounds of applications, they shut it down and aren't accepting new applications until they've gone through everything, because they've had 300% of what they have requested in just those 3 applications. So I think that speaks to the uniqueness of where we are. And yes, I don't think we would stop pursuing subsidies. DOH, Division of Housing, has other grant opportunities as part of its normal financing and portfolio. But not only the dollar amounts, but also the applicability to this project are much narrower for those other programs.
Great, thank you.
Cindy, would you like to ask questions?
Couple concerns, questions. And I know how important it is to the town to get childcare. The childcare center will belong to the town and it comes as a shell. And it's gonna cost a lot of money to turn it into a childcare center. If we don't have somebody in our community that steps up that wants to do that, is the town willing to do that? And are we willing to hire employees to run a daycare center? How important is that daycare center? If we don't get the grants, one option would be to the space that was reserved for childcare to turn it into apartments also and see if that could bring it down, because we're looking at $1,000 a month for a studio apartment. That still isn't what you would call really cheap. Just some of the thoughts that I had to think about.
So in the last scenario, the worst case scenario, you have no childcare center in that one, right? But have you converted that space to rent?
No, that worst case scenario is the picture you saw deleting the childcare center. Theoretically, in this model, town would still own that property that we're thinking about putting the childcare center on. But no, the model does not look at adding housing units to that scenario.
But it could. I mean, you could adjust the model.
Potentially. I think we are within our use by right and zoning requirements right now. It's still a very dense development. It is. And that's based on community engagement, based on the direction from you all, right? Like, we want housing units, we want numbers. That's what we've done. I think the idea of adding additional, especially if we're looking at multiple more units, we'd really have to think critically, and ultimately you all in the Planning and Zoning Commission would have to think critically about, is that density crossing a line to being too much on that property? I don't know the answer to that. We have not explored that as a team, but yes, theoretically we could put more units on. I just don't know what the implications would be.
I have a question related to childcare. Joseph, has there been any thoughts about partnering with somebody as far as this childcare building? Maybe, an investor or something that might want to donate or be part of that building of that and share that cost, maybe?
Yeah, so we have not found, nor have we been looking diligently for a philanthropist type person that might donate money specifically for the childcare space. Right now, the assumption has been lacking grant funding, which is much less available than housing grant money right now. That the cost of that core and shell would be paid for by Fading West, and then paid back through the rents of the project, right? We've been talking with Shining Mountains Montessori School and the Chaffey County Early Childhood Council about the childcare space. And okay, well, if we have a core and shell, who operates it? Who actually pays to build it out, right? And we're actually, Fading West has hired a childcare Center, ECE specialized architecture firm to really design that core shell, but also the basic layout. And we're doing that in partnership with Shining Mountains to make sure we have a local operator having say into what it might look like on the inside. So we're trying to line up the pieces to mitigate the risk that you spoke of, Cindy, which is real, right? The risk of us having a core and shell building, but no operator. And in that case, it will be a decision, how do we use that core and shell space? Do we hold it and hope for an operator or cultivate an operator? Do we build it out in a general commercial space? Do we use it as a town? Do we sell it? I mean, there's a variety of different things that town could do. But that is definitely a risk that we are looking at taking.
Can it be converted from a corn shell to apartments? Like if,
It would likely be really expensive.
okay, like.
It could be converted to a different kind of commercial use. I think going to more of like an office or that type of use, but going to apartments would be pretty difficult.
Okay.
Cindy, did you have more?
I don't see it.
That's it? Okay. Gina?
I kind of have this little bit of a random question in line with my personality, as you all probably know by now, but and this is a little educational for me, but would you mind just sharing a little bit about what goes into the cost of siding per square foot? So just looking at your cost per square foot, I'm just kind of curious how you determine that, or, because I know a little bit of, like what was mentioned earlier is like, it's hard to have those costs quite yet because you can't, the crystal ball, see in the future what things will be, but there's just some general.
Yeah.
So I would love to know that, just help me.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Joseph touched on, we're fortunate in the sense that a lot of that cost with our model is kind of already spoken for and decided for. Like that's the boxes coming out of the factory. There's very little unknowns with that. We know exactly what the cost per square foot coming out of that is going to be. Right now, that's a little bit over half of the all-in per square foot cost you're seeing in these different scenarios. The rest of that is the part that is a little harder for us to predict, and that's the stuff that has to happen on site. So that's starting with, digging the foundations, that's doing all of the electrical wiring, all of the plumbing on site, making connections, any sort of finishing and touch-up work that has to happen once those units get set. We're probably missing some of the site components.
Yeah, exterior cladding. Most of the units will come without cladding, and they'll be, siding will be put on the site, so that'll be an added cost. Setting and stitching is a big cost. I mean, we'll have a crane out there for a long time. That's pricey. So those are some of the costs that are variables versus the more almost the fixed cost, which is the modular box itself.
Which is so for instance, was like the 266 is like the all-in cost.
Yeah.
So the reason why I asked is, this was a great article and I guess interview clip. What was it, 9 News, and it was stated in Mr. Schaefer that it's about 140 to 150 cost per square foot, and that's where I was like,
that's for the modular.
That's the module.
so that's okay. So all right. Well, that's it's good to know. I want to make sure I'm understanding everything, and so it's almost doubled then with all the other add-ons.
Yeah. Yeah. It's about 50-50 between modular and site, give or take. Yeah.
What about the infrastructure costs? How confident are you in those numbers?
I mean,
700,000 versus, so 850.
yeah, there's still some uncertainty in that, especially in light of collegiate commons and a lot of the public infrastructure that we would like to tie into is on collegiate commons property, which would require a utility easement to connect into public infrastructure, which is directly to the northeast of our property. You can see the sanitary sewer and the water line right there in the vacated Utah right of way. So if we can't connect into there, then the infrastructure costs will be higher because we'll have to run a new water line, a new sewer line coming up the improved valley. And that will definitely increase the cost.
Could it double the cost, or is it 150?
I think it's in the 150,000 range of increased cost, yeah. I mean, the parking and other things definitely are substantial costs to the public improvement fees.
And I think we've tried to factor in, obviously doing site work at the farm, and then as well, knowledge of South Main and talking with them and understanding the geology of the site, so we can try to factor all that in.
You mean to tell me that Collegiate Commons owns those lines personally? They maintain them, they can't prevent them from being used if we own them.
So I'll quickly turn this over to Jeff, but I'll give it my interpretation. The dirt under Collegiate Commons is owned by the town. We own our water main, which is in the vacated Utah Street. BV Sanitation owns their sewer main, which is in the vacated Utah Street. Collegiate Commons has a 75-year, Urban Inc. has a 75-year ground lease with the town that was negotiated before and in order to build those apartment buildings. And that ground lease requires mutual approval of both parties for any encumbrances on that property, and easements are encumbrances. So that essentially gives Urban Inc. a veto on accessing our own water main, for instance. And we've been in discussions with them for a while now, and we haven't seen any movement yet on that. So that it is, no bones about it. It's a frustrating place to be. But my understanding is we don't have too many legal ways around that. And Jeff, please jump in.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in. There's sort of two aspects to that. I think, Joseph, you explained the sort of the basic issue pretty well. I mean, ultimately, we have an agreement where we're not going to add more encumbrances to the property. Existing encumbrances, we have a right to access. We have to get at our improvements. So I don't think that's an issue getting to existing improvements. Also, we cannot and we have not contracted away our governmental authority to use our eminent domain powers to get access easements and other easements that we need. So, ultimately, if push came to shove, we would have a authority to basically get whatever easement we need. Obviously, we'd like to avoid doing that. So, the preferred route is to engage with Collegiate on a negotiated basis and just work something out. But if we need it and they don't want to let us use it for an actual town improvement, has to be for a town purpose. So there's some discussion about that. But assuming it's for a legitimate town purpose, we have the right to still get whatever easements we need. But we don't want to go down that road if we can help it, of course.
And just to
And
clarify,
as a note, it's all. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to clarify. There is a 30-foot utility easement in place, right?
That's questionable. Given when the street was vacated versus when the main was put in versus when the ground lease was in effect, we wouldn't have given an easement to ourselves. So there's all these sort of layers that we've been peeling back on.
But we would need an easement to connect into that line, even if there's not an easement existing.
Jeff, I want that to you.
Yeah, probably getting too in the weeds here on a legal issue. There's a number of layers. Probably this one we can go offline on that one and talk about.
Yeah, I guess what I was going to say is the distance we're talking about is like 8 to 10 feet of connection space. It's very minimum.
The short answer is we're hoping we can, at reasonable minds, and apparently it hasn't always been reasonable minds on their side, but hopefully reasonable minds can come to a resolution that works.
Yeah, and as a note, there's also like they have a bank financing that would have to also agree to it. So it's not entirely them. And frankly, I just haven't had the conversation with them. So I would hope that a conversation would get this moving somewhere. I know Joseph's tried, but it does seem to be meeting some resistance. So.
Yes.
Question, and then go back to the childcare question about that. If this doesn't really pan out, or it's not really laying, could we move that to the phase 2 maybe, or does that stay in phase 1? Does that have to be built, that building, along with the apartments? Is that a thought at all?
I mean, I imagine that's probably a decision for the town to make, just in terms of when that childcare space or the land in which it would be built upon gets deeded back to the town. Because right now, I think it's roughly an equal swap of like Fading West, or the project is building that childcare space, the town is deeding that land to the project entity. So that's probably, I would think, a discussion for the town to decide, like, if that does get moved, how does that agreement get structured in the interim?
And from my perspective, I think that it's totally possible if we keep that land that is shown on now vacant, right?
Yeah.
Especially if we do this design exercise that Fading West is already contracted to say, this is what it should look like. Then we won't sort of shoot ourselves in the foot by building a park in the wrong spot or whatever. I think the question that may not change is if we push it to phase 2, 1, construction costs may or may not go down, probably not go down. But 2, the basic model would probably still be an absence of direct subsidy for the childcare itself, that the homes in phase 2 would pay the cost of building that childcare. So instead of it affecting the rents of phase 1, it would affect the sales price of those townhomes that we've been envisioning for phase 2. So it's definitely not off the table, and I think that's a viable option. That if push comes to shove, do we just wait? Do we just defer or make a decision on childcare at a future date?
That might help us with our AMI levels, maybe, maybe on phase 1, maybe bring that cost down and stuff.
In one of the 2 grants, I think we've talked with Joseph, one of the 2 grants, having the childcare on site is definitely an advantage as it relates to that terrific grant. So this is part of that iterative process. If we were to get that grant, then it would be very hard to change what we do with the childcare. And again, that's part of that dialogue we'll have with you all going back and forth.
Question or some, so it's proposed the studio and 1 bath being a total of 30 units. And I was wondering, and then 1 bed, 1 bath, 24, 2 bed, 2 bath, 6. I was wondering, is it possible that we could grow the amount of studios versus the 1 bed, like go to 40, 14, and 6, something like that? Mainly because when we were on the slide about earlier with Becky Gray's information with annual incomes and such, it's much harder, I think, to find that housing for people that are making 35 to 46K, right? There's really not much of that out there at all, right? But for essentially the grouping that, making up to 57, and even 57 to 69, like these are definitely options, but there are, I think, some other options out in the community, maybe not many, but there's really nothing for 35 to 46. So just throwing thought out there, is it possible to maybe do more studio? And I don't know what the rest of the board thinks about that, but I think that's a grouping of folks that struggle the hardest, and they're the ones that are probably in their campers on 4 Mile and things like that. I'd love to be able to try to house them. I think other folks, though, they also need housing. There might be some additional options, and so and with all the subsidies and the potential ARPA and all that, if all of that comes through, I think that would be our best bet as town to get something that is in that range. Personally, if I understand correctly, which.
When would you all have to know the breakdown?
We've already adjusted the unit mix from what we previously presented, which, if I remember correctly, was 36 studios, 12 1-bedrooms, and 12 2-bedrooms. So we moved, we reduced the number of 2-bedrooms and kind of slightly reduced the studios to increase the 1-bedroom units. So there is some flexibility. We can still change.
But maybe from a timing perspective, there is,
Yeah.
because to meet the deadlines, we need to move forward with our design plans.
Yeah.
And there is a point where if we were at a later date to change the unit count, we'd have to, I'll use the term, start over on some of those architectural plans, and that would be an increase in cost. So, I think
Yeah.
Ideally, we want to get moving on the architectural designs
Now, yeah.
effectively now, so.
And I'll just share too, I mean, the unit mix has been a pretty big piece of conversation in the project team. And we've always gone back to what's the housing needs assessment say? What's the data say about our demographics in our community? And trying to think about what does that mean for a prudent unit mix? And I try to pause on the word prudent because I struggle with this myself. When I think about what should the unit mix be, part of me wants to go like, let's just go 70, 80 studios, right? And just get the most bang for the buck. That starts to tip the scales in my mind towards kind of a cringy development a little bit. Like we're just trying to cram housing units in here and at any expense. Whereas the other direction, if we have too many 2-bedroom units and we have this fantasy of having a lot of families moving in here, that doesn't necessarily align with our housing needs assessment data and our demographic data. And so those are the two kind of the swings of the pendulum that we tried to account for in creating this unit mix and recognizing that 1-bedroom apartments allow for they're actually relatively large 1-bedroom, 1,000 square feet, right? They allow for a solid place for a couple to get started, potentially have a single child with them. And it allows for that foothold to move on in their housing journey in a way that felt like it matched the demographic data that we have. So that's just a little bit of backstory on how the unit mix came to be.
Devin, you have some questions?
Yeah, I have some questions and a little bit of comments on that. Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from, Gina, with that. But, you know, as I also think about exactly what Joseph was saying, is that, you know, 400 square foot studio is not big. Like I live in a 200 square foot studio. So, and I don't really want to share that with another person because it's real small. So having a 400 square foot studio would probably be a single occupancy, maybe a couple, but it's still very small. And that way you can help with affordability by having multiple income earners, you know, whether it's a couple or, you know, family members or family. And that can help with the affordability factor if it's more than one person who's paying for that apartment. And that's how I thought about it. I had a couple questions. I think some of this we've gone over, but it's with the deed restriction thing that we just been talking about. I just want some clarity on the deed restriction and 30 years versus whatever we want. Can we do 99 years? And what happens? I know we clarified this earlier, but the property conveyance and what that looks like, because under my impression, it was moving from Fading West to Chafee Housing Authority, and then when the deed restriction runs out, who owns it? Who sells it? Is it going to run out? It seems a little confusing, all that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few pieces that are disconnected from each other, and yet they often start swirling around. One is the length of term for the deed restrictions, and to your question, it could be as short as 15 if you all so chose. It could be in perpetuity or anywhere in between. As Jack mentioned, the state grant funding that we're pursuing, we're not going to receive those if it's anything less than 30 years. We're just not going to be competitive, right? So to me, the minimum, if we're getting state dollars, is 30 years. Obviously, perpetuity is probably the preference of all of us, right? We want to have certainty. Those deed restrictions run with the land, no matter who owns that land, no matter who owns the building, no matter who manages it. It could be Fading West, it could be an investment firm from who knows where, right? If they own the building and the deed restrictions are in effect, they have to abide by the deed restrictions. So that term is really important, but who owns it is important, but they still have to abide by it, right? Whether it's Fading West or someone else. We had a separate document that we had all talked about putting in place before property conveyance, which is the right of first refusal. that deals with that second topic of ownership. So the point at which Fading West might like to sell the property, whether it's subject to deed restrictions at that time or not, town and the housing authority would have right of first refusal to purchase. The purchase price will have more to do with the length of terms of those deed restrictions and the terms of the deed restrictions than it will with who's buying it necessarily. So if we say deed restrictions are in effect in perpetuity, then the sale price is going to be lower and probably more affordable to either town or the housing authority to purchase that project. If the deed restrictions have expired at its market rate, well, then the sale price will be higher, recognizing that the person buying it can charge higher rents and pay back more debt, right? So that idea of right of first refusal is what we have discussed as being the tool town would have to have a say in who owns the property after Fading West, as well as the housing authority.
Okay. Yeah, that helps, but yeah, it's still a lot of things that aren't completely nailed down yet.
Yeah.
And another question I had was about after it's built, is there subsidies or grants available for us to help those AMIs go down, or if town could possibly subsidize part of those rents? Like once everything is built, are we just locked into that forever, or for years and years, or is there any way we can counteract that if we can't get the affordability goals that we're looking for?
Might turn that question over to you guys.
Yeah, I know there's rental assistance programs and things like that tenants can apply for, things like, I'm not exactly sure if there's like a global kind of broad brush, hey, we can discount everyone's rent, but I do know there are programs in Chaffey County that tenants can apply for.
And the housing authority does have now rental assistance programs, deposit guarantee programs, if you need to come up with first month's, last month's deposit guarantee. Right. So those are all programs that would probably work within selection processes. Yeah. I think the question of like, could town just say, hey, if we gave you $50,000 a year, can you lower everyone's rent?
I mean, sure, yes.
I think it would certainly be a discussion, and again, I think we'd be aligned, we're aligned together now, trying to make this work and to meet your goals and then meet what the market requires from a return standpoint. But certainly you wouldn't give us the money without us working with you to make sure it was affordable. But I think there are probably, at that point, there's the rental assistance programs. We'd certainly try to, and I think we built in trying to get the cheapest financing we can to, again, help with affordability. Other programs are probably less likely to come to bear other than just rental assistance.
Yeah, and I appreciate seeing those slides again from the February 22 presentation. That was a really helpful presentation. And I think one of the big things that I took out of that I still think about in this project and a lot of projects is that, these, whatever the numbers that we hit, I think is going to significantly help people. And that right now at market rate, it's not helping. So I think, keeping that in mind and finding ways to hit those better AMIs and, finding more money or more partnerships or whatever, but that's all I have.
We're housing a bunch of our own workers and we're certainly not paying these rents, unfortunately, for the.
Peter, got any questions?
Sue, if you want to go. Round robin. Go back to, Jake, I think you mentioned that it's any of the other grants out there really are only available if it's 60% or lower, right? Does that also include, because another part of the financing is interest rates. So are there lower interest financing options or are those also tied to 60 or below? Or is there in our range, like, I don't know if there's like a low interest loan through USDA for rural workforce housing or HUD for anything like that, that you all have looked into, or that is part of this already, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the financing cost is obviously a big piece of this, particularly once the project is built and stabilized, and we would take out what we call a perm loan that replaces the construction loan, usually lower interest, that the rental income of the property pays off every month. And one of the things we're looking at right now, this is kind of say one of the batches of a new state program targeting more middle income stuff. It's a revolving loan fund program that we could effectively use as a part of that perm loan that would be at a much lower interest rate than a comparable market rate loan would be. So we are actively kind of working toward some of those. I think there's certainly some available for projects in this income range. I think it's probably a similar concern with what we have with some of the other grants, that those are going to be really popular programs, frankly, and it's not guaranteed that we're going to get it, but we're certainly working toward achieving some of those because they could have pretty big impacts on the affordability of this project.
Got it. But that doesn't really play out in the best case, worst case, low case, or anything like that, right?
Right now in our model, we're kind of assuming that we're able to get a piece of that of the major perm loan once the project is stabilized would come from a lower interest rate source.
Okay, so it's part of the mix.
It is,
Yeah, but it's uniform across all three scenarios, right?
It is the same. And I mean, we're also forecasting interest rates going down and as well as getting a smaller subsidy on the debt side. So we've tried to, I don't want to say be aggressive, but we've tried to reflect that we can find more or cheaper financing for our permanent loan. And that's all baked into these numbers, particularly baked into the AMIs.
And that revolving loan fund, I think their max amount is 5 million. Right? So in a $16 million project, it's important, but it's unfortunately not eligible to carry the entire amount of the project. So it would have a piece of the puzzle.
Then, I mean, I brought this up before, and I'm not saying this because I was suggesting it, just an idea in terms of a mix, because I know we need deed restriction, lower cost for ownership as well. But is there any way to play with the mix of phase 2 in terms of, say, like half of them don't have to be deed restriction, they could be market rate or something like that, that could then impact phase 1, that would then lower the rent overall, so or lower the AMI. So.
Yeah, I think the challenge with that right now is these are likely going to be financed as 2 separate projects. So if one starts basically subsidizing the other, that gets really hard to reconcile with 2 separate investor bases, essentially.
No, I think that's right.
And unfortunately, we are not at a point where we can speed up phase 2 at the moment.
Somebody could own that slice of land.
Right. I mean, we have to finish the eminent domain on that triangle. We have to move through vacating right of way. We have to do all these things.
But I think you could pursue those strategies within phase 2. So if, a portion weren't deed restricted, then you could help the balance of phase 2. Right. It wouldn't be too hard. I think
they're just 2 separate.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I just want to mention, just jumping onto the childcare conversation, I think when I annoyed the entire board and everybody in the room with all my questions about childcare, the one thing that really got at least drilled into me was they need the building first, and then that's what you can fundraise towards. And until you have a building, you really can't fundraise much towards that. At least that was my takeaway, that they need, for all the different grants out there or people who are investing in early childcare education or anything like that, all those kind of come once you have a building. Until you have a building, you really can't use towards it. At least my understanding. So pushing that off would just push off any idea of additional funds we could possibly.
I mean, it is that question of like who puts their skin in the game first. No one wants to do it first. But in this space, and Lisa Lane is here with Shining Mountain Montessori, and we've chatted and in talking with the school district and talking with Early Childhood Council, it's absolutely the case that if there's demonstration of public support like this, of building a building, the competitiveness of a grant application or matching funds coming into that project goes way up. Not to say it's guaranteed, but it goes way up for those operators that might look to open a child care center versus just having a vacant lot that's sitting there. So I do think it's a question of, yes, we have risk, But when you zoom out and ask, is our community needing childcare and are we willing to take that first step? That probably is a catalyst for creating a solution in that space.
And then, sorry, just one last thing, just the thought of, just because I know that there will be conversation about could town, you mentioned the ARPA funds, that's $400,000 and really to start making a dent on dropping the rent, like the AMI average, we're talking, again, you're talking like $5 million that would be subsidized, some along those lines, right? Which we obviously don't have in our budget, but you know, like that's, because it was mentioned earlier, like, will the town have to throw in more money to subsidize them? And it seems like unless you're talking a really big chunk of change, it's not gonna drop the overall. Like, it won't lower the AMI by all that much unless you're talking significant money, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a little overstated just at which the scale it makes a difference. I mean, like, we're applying for about $3 million of grants, and that basically takes this project from the only way it works is if it's market rate to like, actually, we can make this pretty affordable, like getting around 100% AMI. So, I mean, I think you're right in the sense that $400,000 in the net scheme of like all the AMIs for 60 units is not going to make a huge difference, but I mean, every bit does help, and it's I think somewhere between the 400,000 and 5 million, it does start to make a pretty noticeable difference on AMIs.
Okay.
Yeah, and if we were coming up with that money, we'd probably have to borrow it. You know, and so we'd be going again, maybe against the same pool of money that you're talking about, where you're getting the favorable interest rates. So we would just have to hope that that was really there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know what sort of borrowing availability exists for municipalities versus
Yeah,
private
make it a
developers.
lot
I imagine it's a little
lot
bit
more
different.
complicated. Sure. So, questions?
I have just one question. Most of the things I was thinking about have been asked and answered. And I don't know if this is relevant now. I just don't want to miss an opportunity or have this before closed, but I saw that there's a $185 utility assessment, and that's, utility allowance. And that's part of the rent, is that right?
Yeah, so that's a really important clarification. I'm glad you asked that. So the AMIs that we show up there, 80% AMI is the, like, we'll show a rent number for a specific income range, like the studios, for example. So that 967, we would add $185 to that, and that is the all-in cost that the tenant pays. So that's their rent and utilities. So the way AMIs are structured is it includes basically all of their housing costs, including utilities.
But it would be 185 on top of 967.
Correct.
And that number is 80%.
Is 80%. Yes.
So 80% AMI is not the 967 number. 80% AMI is assuming 967 plus the rest of the housing costs.
I see.
If that makes sense.
And that's an estimate today, but the combined number is what ties to that 80% AMI.
Sure. So my question comes back to just what, if anything, could we do with energy efficiency to ultimately reduce cost of energy or utilities for the residents, understanding that we're not looking to spend more money right now, but probably less, but still, where do those things stand? You updated us before, but I just thought I'd figure out.
I'll give a very brief note and then I'll turn it over because I know Fading West has been working a lot on this. There's a big question right now. Some of the grant programs nudge you and or strongly encourage you to implement high energy efficiency technologies such as heat pumps or those types of pieces. And Fading West is exploring those in their modular manufacturing, as I understand it. Those also come with obviously higher upfront costs, but there's rebates available both locally and state and federal help offset those. And then one of the other implications right now is building codes. And are those going to be updated at a time that might affect this project? On the positive side, on the energy consumption, on the negative side, on the increased costs, right? So all those things are being explored, but we don't have specific new funding sources only for energy efficiency upgrades right now.
Okay, and is it possible to pursue grants just for that purpose that would go along with this? I mean, I realize there's some, just what you said, that there's some nudging as part of what we're requesting, but are there other things we could be going after, or is it too soon? I just don't want to have this opportunity foreclosed.
Sure, yeah, and we're definitely having those conversations with the state energy office and others. To date, we haven't found a grant program that applies to this project yet.
Okay,
But we are definitely looking.
thanks.
I would flag, I mentioned this in an email, I don't know if passed on if you guys you already looked at it as well, but I think both Fannie and Freddie have low interest loans for specifically, I think, the energy components, but it's like multifamily green housing, low interest loans that, at least I was talking to a friend of mine at the Green Builders Association, is like, it's a national standard, so that means that they have to make it somewhat enticing to people in Missouri and in Colorado, and since Colorado already has strict standards, that to bridge that gap might not be as expensive.
No, you're right. You're right. This, already a lot of what we build is thinking about being more efficient as a product, insulation. We use 2x6 studs. And so we are definitely focused on that. In fact, tomorrow we have a session. We partnered with EU with Denver University, and a number of their students came out to the International Builders Show. Specifically, they had different, I'll say different tasks, but one group was tasked with trying to evaluate all the opportunities to bring in more efficient heating and cooling systems to our products. So we're brainstorming with them tomorrow. So that is a constant focus of ours, because obviously we're hearing it from you, we're hearing it from all of our customers. So
Great, thank you.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes left. Anybody have last burning questions that you do? Oh, okay.
And I probably, maybe you should know this, but we had talked at one point about, from an operational standpoint, town might need some workforce housing as well. So if we were contributing, some money towards this, that might be one option is some town workforce housing. And we have a little bit of that. We don't know what the future is going to hold. And so that's just a point, I guess, more than anything, just to know. And I don't know, was it figured in to this or?
So right now, there's no, in the model and in the sort of rent assumptions, there's no guaranteed town unit or, free town unit, so to speak. We haven't even, I think briefly talked about this at a few different points in our discussions, but I think there's absolutely opportunity to consider pursuing a master lease scenario where if we really want to lock in a few housing units as a town, we can enter into some sort of master lease with Fading West and, have that security, right? And when employees are living there, then the employees are paying the rent, and when they're not, then town's picking up the tab. But there's opportunities for that. But right now, there's no built-in sort of like, oh, town gets these 3 units included.
And the reason I bring that up is because obviously we do have some positions that would fall into these types of AMIs. So, and, trying to bring people in from out of state or, we have a lot of specialized positions that it's very hard to find here in BV locally or regionally. So it's just a consideration. And then I had it and then I lost it. I guess that's it. I think that was the biggest one.
Jeff, do you have any things that we need to be thinking about?
Muted.
Oh, you're muted.
No, I know. I couldn't get the mute button to work. No, I think you guys have covered most of it. And our office can prepare pretty much whatever documents that reflect the deal. And so ultimately you need to decide what is an AMI that the town's willing to accept, what the benefits the town's going to get in return for what the town's providing. And ultimately we can put it in writing. Some things will be easier than others, depending on how complicated you want to make things, but nope, I don't have much else to add.
Just in general, what would be the decisions we have to make? like the AMI target?
Yeah, so looking forward, we will, and I'll be reaching out to Jeff and Catherine imminently, but we'll be bringing forward a proposed amendment to the property conveyance agreement for your all's approval that would really just look at changing that due diligence timeline from March 31st to June 30th. So that'll be the first decision that you all will have before you. Again, that's all to allow us to get more certainty on these pieces before we have the other decisions. Then that next series of decisions, I think it's kind of an open question as to whether it's sort of a all at once sequential set of decisions, or whether we spread out these decisions a little bit. And what I mean by that is that before we can execute and close on conveying the property, there's conditions of closing in that conveyance agreement. Those conditions require us to have executed deed restrictions, a development agreement, executed right of first refusal. So those are decisions that you all will need to make before closing on the property or authorizing closing on the property. Those all can be made, like this minute we're doing this one and all within the same meeting. Or if it makes sense, maybe we spread those decisions out a little bit. Just kind of depends on when we have those levels of certainty. So those are the next piece of decisions. Separately, the minor subdivision plat has been submitted, is under review. That will be an administrator approval plat to consolidate these lots into the 2 lots. And then there's also the major site plan review process that the Planning and Zoning Commission will end up deciding on in a public hearing for the site plan itself. The other decision that you'll see on your agendas at that appropriate time, and probably together with all those other ones I just mentioned, is the PIA, right? Or the public improvement agreement. That may or may not be the same document as the development agreement. But those are all the various decisions that will be involved in kind of pushing this fully out of Towns Court and fully into Bating West Court. And ideally, if we meet our due diligence deadline of June 30th, all those decisions will need to be made 30 days later, unless we mutually agree to change that closing date. So we theoretically have until the end of July.
Okay. Do you all have other comments you want to make or suggestions?
I mean, I'd just say similar, we've talked with investors, our investor network about this project, but haven't completed that process. We certainly wanted to get through this meeting, making sure we were all still collectively viewing the opportunity the same way, I'll say. But so our plans, in addition to the work on design and continuing getting ready for development, is going out and talking with equity partners and lenders to make sure they align with, again, collectively what we're trying to do, so that there aren't any surprises for you or for us as we get to that June date. So that's work we've got to do between now and then to, again, make sure, again, there are no surprises as it relates to being able to get this thing completed the way we all want it to be.
Great.
Okay, I guess just in closing, so we'll email out if I don't mention it, but like the worst case scenario, and I know this doesn't include the corn shell and all that. I like if we didn't get the grants, right, and then it'd be potentially 15-year deed restrictions. I personally don't know if I could actually move forward with it at that point, especially if the AMI average is 105. I might say it's better to wait and try to find more funding, because I'd be worried that we'd get 15 years of something that's not quite what we want, and then it would be market rate and we'd lose it. So it would have been a short-term solution for something that could be a long-term issue. And so I hope we don't have that come up at all. I'm batting for, I want perpetuity. I'll just put it out there. Big surprise. But if somehow it boils down to 15%, I'm gonna have a pretty tough time at that meeting on going along with that. And I'm just sharing that now. So if we do get to that, everybody understands where I'll be at with that. So just want to share that obviously with you as well. Because that is something that's really important to me in terms of this town's land. We're happy, excited to do all this, but it needs to be something I think that we can use for forever and ever, or as long as we possibly can. Not something too short, because it defeats the purpose then at that point, right? 15 years and then potentially, could be back in the same situation. So anyhow, like I said, it'll bother me if
I realize that we don't get to pick which scenario we get.
No, I know.
Let's not pick worst case.
Agreed. I don't think we have the answer to this, and you're mentioning you don't have that 80% number necessarily for the numbers, but the one concern I have is we go through with all of this, but we're at that 90% or even at the 80%, and frankly, to Devin's point of 400 square feet isn't a ton. If there really is a market out there for people who are like, you know what, yeah, I'll spend $1,111 for 400 plus square feet, plus the energy, plus something else. I'm like, or I'll just live in my car. Like, are we going to be trying to hit a market that doesn't actually exist for that price? Is the only concern I have. That obviously I don't think we can answer that, but and it could be that there's definitely a market that, that 25% or 30% roughly that might fall into that really would pay that and want that. But I guess part of my concern is we build all this and folks like that's just too high for this. Still gonna live in my car, sure. We're in a house with 4 of my friends or something, which is fine. Like I just don't know if we then have all these empty units and what's the answer there?
Our goal is, we never want to end the meeting with worst case. So our goal is that's not the last slide.
Last slide is not the best case.
Right, yes, one best case.
We're with you. No, there's a lot of competition for these grants, but I think, Joseph's done a great job getting it teed up, and we're very hopeful we'll have success.
Well, thank you. It's been a challenge for all of us, and yet it's a wonderful project. So let's get it done. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks.
We'll start our regular meeting at 7 o'clock.
Well, yeah.
Okay.